Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. Alina, who have we got with us today?
We've got with us Joana Valdez-Tullett, who's a prehistoric archaeologist working with Historic Environment Scotland on Scotland's Rock Art Project. Welcome, Joanna. Hi.
Hi, hello.
Really
We're
looking
so
forward to
excited.
this one. Yay! Well, as ever, let's start with the basics and get an explanation or definition from you. What is rock art?
Right, so we tend to use the term rock art to talk about designs, motifs that are painted or carved on rocky surfaces. So natural boulders, outcrops, caves and shelters, and so on. So that's like the basic definition of what rock art is. Of course, if we think about the word art, it's a slightly controversial term, so not everyone really likes to kind of use the term rock art, because we know from anthropology and ethnography that people certainly in prehistory would not necessarily or could not necessarily have the concepts of art and artists that we have now that are very based on our kind of Eurocentric visions. But it's a very loaded term, so I think that most people just use it anyway because we know what we're kind of talking about.
Would you maybe call it rock art, not rock art, but rock drawings?
There have been some suggestions for other names. So instead of rock art, you will find that some people might refer to carvings, particularly carvings on rocks, as petroglyphs, and paintings as pictographs. There's even there are other suggestions of other terms like PPEF, which is basically an acronym for pictographs, petroglyphs, engravings, and figures. There's somebody else kind of suggested petroiconology. There's an Indian word, Purakala. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That is also kind of related and has also been put forward as a substitute for rock art, or epipentology. I don't know. There's been all sorts of suggestions of other names, but I think generally people stick to either rock art or petroglyphs or pictograms. Or
just keep it simple if in doubt.
I think.
I was going to say, it doesn't really roll off the tongue of the others, do they? It's like these incredibly long, complicated rock art, simplistic, or rock drawings.
Exactly. And I think, people have been referring to rock art for, such a long time. It's such it has so much baggage in the term, it's just very difficult to kind of unload that and unpick it and just come up with a completely new term that people will get used to it. So I think in general, rock art is used for that. There are, however, kind of slight differences, and I think this is more like a language thing. So for instance, in English or in, let's say, Anglo-Saxon kind of traditions, there tends to be a distinction between rock art and cave art. So cave art would be like the paintings, and rock art would be everything else that's outdoors, like carvings. So where I come from, we just use, or at least what we translate as rock art. It's basically like a more universal term that encompasses everything. And then, we have paintings and carvings, indoors, outdoors, like that. But yeah, I use the term rock art all the time. I find it, I like it. I think that it's kind of useful. It's, something that people relate to it more easily. So I just tend to use it.
Where did your interest come from?
You mean in rock art?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it kind of happened a little bit accidentally, really, because when I was doing my undergrad, we had 4 years undergrad, and in each year we had a practical module where we'd go out like digging or doing some field survey or whatever. And in a couple of years, we actually had the opportunity to go to this one place in Portugal. That's where I did my undergrad, called Foscoa, which is well known for its open air Paleolithic rock art. It was actually found like in the mid 90s, and then there was this kind of huge problem because it was going to be submerged by the waters of a dam that was being built at that point. In fact, they were kind of surveying the area because of the dam, and that's why eventually they found these carvings. And so yeah, we had the opportunity to go there and kind of do some work, and it was love at first sight, I think, because the landscapes are absolutely amazing. We were doing some really cool work, so we were going out looking for new stuff. And also we were doing some recordings. We were documenting the rock art at night. So kind of carrying these great big generators to attach these very powerful lamps for raking light, and then recording them. And it was just really, really fascinating. And I ended up going there a second time, and then my final project for my undergrad was again about rock art. And then it just kept happening. I just kept I started working, and there were some jobs that also involved rock art, and then I did my master's, and then it never left me. I just kept going. Yeah.
I love that. It just kept following you around, every turn, every corner, everything, rock art.
Exactly, because I was actually more interested in lithics even, It was like I never really thought about doing anything, I think that it was always going to be prehistory, but yeah, I was more into other types of things. And then, it just happened. I think it chose me. I didn't choose it, I guess.
It's a typical historian rabbit hole, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
So where can we find, I mean, we've already touched on this, but where can we actually find rock art?
Yeah, so rock art is kind of, I think it's a very, I was going to say human thing, but of course it's a human thing because it's made by humans. But but you can find it everywhere, wherever people were and lived. That you can find rock art. So you have it like all in every continent, and it was created across all the periods. I mean, even today you have communities that still produce rock art, and I don't know, some people also, there is this kind of debate, where do we draw the line? Is graffiti kind of in this category, for instance, or modern graffiti? But that's a complete different discussion. But yeah, so you find it pretty much everywhere.
What kind of images are we talking about? I'm guessing, again, it's a massive span.
Yeah, so it very much depends where you are. There are two, so we tend to kind of categorize it in two ways. We're either looking at figurative art, which has representations of things that we can identify, so the animals that we see in the caves, or people. There's some traditions of rock art that have depictions of, say, houses and carts and all sorts of things, boats, things that we can identify, that we relate with, that we know, the objects that we know. We tend to call figurative art. And then there's everything else that we don't really know what it is, that is more abstract and geometric. So these are the two main groups of rock art that we have. And then depending on where you are, you will have more incidents of one or other tradition. So for instance, if you look at Iberia, you have Iberia has a very complex kind of prehistory, because there's people coming from all sorts of places, and there's lots of different traditions of rock art there. So you have like the Levantine rock art, where you have people and hunting, and you have animals, but you also have, like, in the Northwest, we have what we call Atlantic rock art, which is basically it's my specialism, which is basically composed of like little cut marks, which are very small, kind of 2 to 4 centimeters circles dug onto the cut onto the rock, and then they may or may not be surrounded by concentric rings. So it's all very geometric. It's just circles and spirals and things like that. So I mean, we have names for these shapes, of course, but we don't really relate to them in the way that we don't know what they mean, basically. It depends. And then, for instance, if you think about hand stencils, we find hand stencils all over the place. We have them in Europe, in our Paleolithic caves, but we also have them in Argentina, in Indonesia, in all sorts of places around the world. So yeah, it depends where you are. Yeah, I guess.
Coming back, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, is it Foscoa?
Yeah, Foshkoa, yeah, that's right.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what you found there? Because that is the site that I think, as you said, it's one of the sites that inspired you to do this.
Yeah, I mean, Foshkoa is really, it's amazing, you know. You have, so basically Foshkoa is a valley, you know. You have this one big valley, and there's like around 17 kilometers of that valley with lots of like schist outcrops on each side, these very kind of vertical and flat, very smooth as well, rock surfaces. And a lot of them are just completely covered in engravings. They're all engraved or carved outdoors. We don't know if they were painted. I mean, there is one site where there are paintings. There's an overhang, so there's some paintings, but they're kind of alongside some other motifs that are a little bit older, so they're not quite Paleolithic. So I don't know whether they were actually, you know, the Paleolithic motifs would be painted, or the Neolithic people came, they painted their own stuff, and then they painted over the Paleolithic stuff, which, you know, could have happened. But essentially, Foshkoa has it's mostly animals that are depicted. So we have horses, lots of horses, cervids like deer and roe deer, goats and aurochs. There's some really large aurochs in some of these places, and in, I think, the older kind of stages, so it was carved for, you know, maybe 20,000 years or something like that. And some of the yeah, and it's like they just kept coming back and kind of carving that and carving over, and it's just this kind of tradition that lasted in time for such a long time. And we can see the differences in the style of the animals. You know, they were designed slightly different in different ways. And obviously, you know, there's been kind of excavations, and they were so lucky to find, you know, some panels that were actually sealed, so they can actually relate the carvings with stratigraphic layers and stuff. So it's, you know, they have a good grasp of chronology there at the moment. So yeah, and so animals, and they're mostly drawn with very, very fine incisions, so you can hardly see them, you know, especially with all the weathering after how many thousands of years. So it's really challenging, but it's amazing. And then they did this wonderful thing where they just carved over and over and over. There is this one rock that is known as Spaghetti Rock, because all you get to see is these kind of really, you know, lines all over the place. And then when you actually start looking and trying to kind of individualize the motifs, you start seeing the animals coming up. It's really interesting.
I ask you what your favorite one is that you found at Foshkoa? Or that you've seen, maybe not that you discovered, but that you've seen.
Yeah, well, I tend to like the animals, but I think that the one that people might relate more with, or tend to kind of, you know, like more, is this man. There is this depiction of a man called Homem de Piscos, which basically means man of Piscos, which it's a stream that is adjacent to the Foshkoa River. And he's a really funny guy, because you know, he's a bit bald, or he looks a bit bald, and he's kind of incised just with one single line, and he has lots of anatomical details. So there's an eye, there's an ear, he has a line kind of on top of his mouth, which, you know, it almost looks like a very kind of thin mustache, which possibly it isn't, but and he has this really large erect penis, which people obviously love.
Yeah, I bet it's really hard. I bet you get asked about that all the time, as opposed to any of the interesting ones.
It's like, oh, animals, oh, man with big penis, absolutely.
Yeah, Alina's soul, she's obsessed with Naples and the penis museum.
Yeah.
And then he has these kind of fumes coming out of his head. I don't know if they're related to, you know, his penis. God knows. I don't know. Yeah, so that's a funny one there. I think people really enjoy. And again, it's something that people relate with, you know. With all the animals, we don't know why they were depicting animals, but that man, we certainly know why why they depicted it. But yeah.
I think the only other thing I've seen in situ is at Wadi Rum. I've seen there's ibex drawn on there, which is historically significant because they're not present in the region anymore, but they would have been when this
Yeah,
caravan was passing through, and so that's really pretty.
yeah, yeah.
You know, I saw a really funny cartoon. Actually, I thought of you, Joanna, when I saw it on was it Twitter or Facebook, one of those. It's a prehistoric cartoon where this baby is crying and the woman's shouting at the caveman, saying, "Just entertain the baby." So he starts drawing animal pictures on the wall to entertain the baby.
Yeah, I think I've seen something like that as well. Yeah, there's lots of cartoons. I think cave art is something that it's just so present, you know, that if you find it everywhere, like in particularly in movies, there's this fascination with it, you know, whether they're kind of for kids or not. You know, there's like Brother Bear or whatever it's called. Even in The Lion King, you have some cave paintings there, you know, and you know, there's that follow-up of Alien movies, or I don't. Is it Prometheus or something?
That's
There's
right,
some cave
yeah.
paintings, yeah. And there was this other movie with these, I can't remember the name because it's a bit obscure, but they have these kind of cave paintings that were predicting something terrible happening in the future. So I think there's a fascination with it. I think
It's used
mostly
to progress
because
the plot in Ice Age, isn't it? It's how you found out what happened, or how they show you what happened to Manny's first family.
That's right. Yeah. And they're actually animated there, isn't it? They can kind of, you see
Yeah.
the hopping mammoth. It's so sweet. Yeah, absolutely.
How does rock art compare to other types of prehistoric art?
Yeah, so I mean, prehistory, there's all sorts of types of creative activities going on. So they weren't just well, certainly in periods from, you know, the Neolithic onwards, we start seeing other types of decorations. So they were decorating pottery and even certainly in Europe. Obviously, I'm talking about a European context. But we see pottery decorated, we see artifacts, we see, like here in Scotland, we have these kind of stone bowls, carved stone bowls that nobody really know what they were for. You have mace heads, so all sorts of things that are decorated, and obviously the megalithic monuments as well, which some of them were decorated as well. And even we find carvings inserted in domestic contexts, like if you think about the Ness of Brodgar or Scar Bray. What kind of, how we compare them in this very specific context. I'm always a little bit wary about comparisons, especially when we're kind of talking about different cultural and chronological contexts. You know, I'm always a little bit concerned when people say, "Oh yes, cup and rings," because that's what I kind of study. I've seen those in Hawaii or whatever, you know, and then they come up with this kind of theory that explains all of them, and I was like, you know, different contexts, different chronologies. They might have been doing them for different reasons, but anyway, I appreciate that you know, the designs are similar, but I think context is really key. So yeah, I mean, if we think about here, there is definitely some familiarity of motifs in terms of the megalithic art and what we find in open air, but you know, also the type of techniques that they were using to carve as well, sometimes they're kind of similar, and you know, yeah, and in terms of motifs, I guess that's one of the biggest things, isn't it? Because if there are examples of megalithic art, so for instance, there are these really interesting spirals and a stone circle in Kilmartin here in Scotland in Templewood, and we look at the Garbaldisham mace head, which is an artifact, which is decorated with the same type of spirals, kind of placed on that smaller artifact in a very similar way. Yeah, so there are some similarities like that, but I think, yeah, I mean, designs, you know, techniques, and even sometimes the way that they were producing things, you know, like I'm thinking, for instance, there is this amazing work by Andrew Jones and Marta Diaz Guardamino here in the UK, where they were looking at how decorations were implemented in artifacts and stuff, and there was a lot of like erasure, and you know, it's like there's a sequence of doing, and we find this sequence of doing things in other contexts, so open air art as well. So in that sense, there are, we can compare, but obviously not just stylistically.
I know Alex has asked you about your favourite find at the site in Portugal, but have you got a favourite find ever? Like in all of the research you've ever done, do you have one?
Yeah, I do. I do. So this is again, it's another site in Portugal that I worked in, and we were basically, me and a friend of mine, we were basically hired to do this kind of survey in this very dangerous valley. It's a very kind of V-shaped, very inhospitable valley. Um, because so prior to a dam, we love dams in Portugal. It is what it is. They keep kind of building them, and then anyway, and we went to do this survey, which was very challenging actually, but we ended up finding this shelter. There was already some knowledge about it, and we knew that there were these kind of prehistoric carvings on it. And then we prepared everything to go there and kind of record it. And at some point, we were looking at this rock, on a panel on the outside of the shelter. And my friend was like, oh, have you seen this? There's some weird kind of, you know, wavy lines here. Is it a snake? And then suddenly we're there just staring at that wall for a while. And then we were like, hang on, I'm not sure I'm seeing this straight. And I was like, yeah, this is, it can be, can it? And then suddenly we were just shouting in excitement because we found it was another kind of Paleolithic carving, and it's actually a really interesting site because one, it's really unexpected. It's still the only one in that valley, and there is so the depiction of this goat, it's like it's going up. There's some movement to it as well. They tend to be a little bit static, and this one is actually there's a little bit of movement. And there is this one main image which is like in front of the other one, like leading the herd. And it's really interesting because this you have the same body for three different heads, which is not unusual in Paleolithic art, but they tend to be heads of the same type of animal species. And in this case, you have the one body for three heads of different species. So we have, it's like the first thing that was carved was the head of an aurochs, which was then overlain by a horse, and in the end they decided to go with a deer. So it's just quite unique so far anyway. And and it's just a really exciting find, and I think it will be difficult to top that one up. Maybe it doesn't sound very exciting for other people, but certainly for me it was a great find.
It sounds brilliant. But tell us about your research now. So you're looking at specifically, aren't you, prehistoric rock art in Scotland? What kind of stuff are you finding there?
Yeah, that's right. So it kind of follows some work that I've done before. And again, what we have here in Scotland is mostly this tradition that it's commonly called Atlantic rock art. So basically, because of its geographic distribution, it's a type of carvings. It's only carvings that were being created between the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age. And essentially the iconography, so the type of motifs that they were using, is very geometric and very abstract, and it's mostly like cup marks and cup and rings, which is like little dots with concentric circles and spirals and what we call rosettes and things like that, and linear grooves. So a lot of these motifs are kind of connected with lines, and this is the same type of rock art that we find in other parts of Western Europe, like in Ireland, obviously in England as well, and in Iberia. So both the northwest of Portugal and the northwest of Spain as well. So that's where the name comes from. And that's what I'm doing here. So I'm kind of I'm working with Scotland's Rock Art Project, and we have this kind of community engagement project going on, and we are currently recording, or we were, because COVID kind of halted all that, but but we were recording the rock art that exists in the country. So Scotland holds about 40% of the rock art that we know for Britain.
Wow.
And it's a lot of sites here.
Is that because it's less built up, so it's survived?
I guess to a certain extent, I think that's that is one. It might be one of the reasons. Yeah. It could be also a little bit of research bias, because there are clusters of rock art that are quite famous up here as well. And, people tend to come, and then you find more. And there are, across time, there were people who really dedicated themselves to look for rock art here. And so we're recording all this rock art, and, with a systematic methodology to create this kind of database that we are now starting to analyze and try to understand what the role of this rock art was for the prehistoric communities.
Do we actually know anything about these people who created rock art? Because you said you find something similar in other places in Europe.
Yeah, I think in terms of the people who created it, we don't really know much, or even, why they created it. Again, we don't really know much about that. What I find really fascinating about this type of rock art is that, again, as you said, we have it in other parts of Europe, and there seems to be this like universal understanding of the rock art of this tradition. It's like, I mean, in my previous study, I was able to kind of identify very small details of in the making process of this rock art. I was talking about it earlier, this making process that you see repeated in all these countries. So it suggests that the rock art was actually taught, between these communities, because we know that they were in contact. We know that there were, networks of exchange of artifacts, of people, animals, ideas. And the rock art tradition just came along with it as well. And it must have been really important because, people just started creating it in very, very kind of far apart regions, especially if you think about the Neolithic, Ireland and Iberia would be really far apart, wouldn't they? So yeah, we don't know about the people, but we know that they were somehow united in this belief that, the rock art was important enough to create it extensively. Yeah.
So what does it all mean then? Is that as much as we can take for it? Do we just take it? Does it tell us anything historically about how they created art? I'm just looking like for where it fits in sort of the history of humankind.
Yeah. So for this type of rock art specifically, well, that's $1 million question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean?
Yeah.
Because obviously we don't know the meaning of the symbols behind the symbols, and honestly, we'll never know. We really will never know.
But it is teaching us that they valued it as not maybe even as a skill, but as a part of their culture if they're handing it down.
Definitely, but even even the skill itself, because you can there are examples of rock art that looks like this, but that it isn't, because it wasn't made the same way. So they were teaching kind of teaching each other not only the symbols, because it's not a simple manner of it's not a simple copy of symbols of it's not a simple copy of the images. They actually knew where to use it, how to create it, because even the carving techniques are similar in all the regions. So there's this whole package that is kind of shared, and obviously we don't know the meaning of these things, and we know that from ethnography, that a simple circle can have so many different meanings depending on where it is located, what kind of motifs they are created alongside with, who creates it even, and the technique. So and this similarity really suggests that they're kind of united in this. They were doing this together because they understood the importance of this rock art. There are, however, regional variations, and that probably reflects the different communities, because they would all have social and cultural backgrounds, different from each other. They were living far apart. They had their own, ways of life. So there are some differences, but essentially, the core of the tradition is there. But there are lots of theories about what this rock art was for. Obviously, it's a really big enigma for everyone, and people tend to say that, they're ancient languages or systems of writings, places of worship and to sacrifice. And there was this Scottish lawyer in the mid 20th century. He published this book, well, Ronald Morris actually. He published a book where he listed 104 theories that would possibly explain why these carvings were made. And so he compiled this, and he ranked the theories in order of plausibility. So he used 10 for those that were, could be, certain that was the reason or almost, and then 5, it was a reasonably sensible idea, but perhaps it wasn't true, and then 0 was a seemingly impossible idea, which, I'm not sure why he listed things that he didn't think were possible, but anyway, he just kind of compiled it.
He sounds pretty pompous.
I know, it's really interesting. And some of them he says, these are all kind of astronomical symbolism and alignments and maps of the landscape and fertility and stuff, which, you're like, yeah, maybe. But then others is like, these are messages from outer space, or these were used for blood sacrifices, or these are images of cow pats. And everything, they have everything in there. It's a really, interesting and funny list to go through, actually.
What's the most ludicrous thing on his list?
Oh God, I don't know. I think the cow pats are quite.
As if they've chose to immortalize cow pats as something.
Yeah, awesome. I know. It's just, I don't know who would think about that. It's just so strange. Yeah, but there are kind of more academic, theories about it as well, and there is all this idea of like organizing the territory or communication even, because these communities even locally would not perhaps be seeing each other very much, and perhaps this was a way of kind of communicating between them. So yeah, there are other ideas about it, but it's like anyone can say anything about it, really, as long as you can kind of back it up, because we'll never know what the symbols meant. So just one of those things.
Joanna, thank you so much for coming on board. I mean, I think you've converted me to prehistory rock art, and that is an impressive thing to do. Just so you know.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, so I really want to get out there now and see more.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to go out. I want you to take us out there and show us this, because it just sounds so interesting.
I would love to come and visit. Come to Scotland, and I'll show you the amazing stuff that we have here. And thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Anytime you want to come back and discuss more prehistoric stuff with us, please do.
If you're not too, if it wasn't too much, but yeah, absolutely, that would be lovely. I can tell you more, much more.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks so much.
And join us tomorrow when Satvinder Jus will be with us to talk all about the legal heresy, as he terms it, that went on with the execution of Indian revolutionary Bhagat Singh. So don't miss out on that. It's a really interesting story, and it's going to make you quite angry as well. Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year, and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them. So don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.